And now back to Bobby Likis Car Clinic and your host, Bobby Likis.
And welcome back to Bobby Likis Car Clinic. Give us a call with your car questions at 888-227-2546. That's 888 Car Clinic. You know, from time to time, we've talked about spark plugs and fuel injection and different types of fuel with the octane enhancer of ethanol. And one of the most interesting to me is the technology that we're seeing in new cars these days, computer-controlled technology. The same thing is true for spark plugs. I remember when copper and nickel were the go-to metals, but that's long since changed. And joining us now from Denso is Matt Eaton, manager for maintenance products, who's going to give us the update on the latest information about spark plugs and the new Iridium TT from Denso. Matt, welcome back to Bobby Likis Car Clinic.
Thank you, Bobby. Glad to be here.
As I said, the copper and nickel were the go-to metals years ago, but that's all changed. Share with our Car Clinic listeners and viewers the key to better performance from better spark plugs.
Well, the real key to better performance is to minimize the interference of the spark so it can grow sort of unhindered. And the older style plugs have these very bulky electrodes. And in some cases, actually, back in the 80s and 90s, there was multiple electrodes. There was sort of a fad going on there. And these electrodes actually absorb the spark's energy and reduce combustion efficiency and performance. Our Iridium TT, or twin-tip concept, minimizes this interference with the spark plug. And our Iridium center electrode tip is actually only 0.4 millimeters, the world's smallest, and the ground is 0.7 millimeters, so very, very small tips.
So because of the small surface area of the flame producer, more of the flame gets into the combustion chamber, which is where it does its work, correct?
That's right, exactly. The energy is not being absorbed, and it's growing.
You know, it seems that the vast majority of vehicles nowadays comes with Iridium spark plugs. Why Iridium? I know that that's a precious metal. I know it's part of the platinum family, but just how great is Iridium?
Well, Iridium is actually one of the densest metals on Earth, and that density leads to a strong resistance for corrosion and oxidation, so better than any other metal. And this means we can design smaller electrodes, very small electrodes. As I mentioned before, that we have the world's smallest at 0.4 millimeters, and those small electrodes perform better and yet still last far longer than the conventional spark plugs.
We're talking with Matt Eaton from Denso Auto Parts. Now I'm intrigued on the 0.4 millimeter twin tips. How do you connect something so small to something so large, even though the spark plugs are smaller today than they've ever been? But how do you attach those and have the structural integrity of attaching something needle-like to a body of a spark plug?
Well, Denso has the unique position to also be a manufacturer of robots. So back in the 90s, we employed the first, I believe it was the first for any spark plug, a robotic laser welding process. So we designed our robots and designed the process and patented back in the 90s for the OEs. And we're still using that same process. So it's a 360-degree laser weld, robotic laser weld, as I mentioned. And it makes it a very consistent weld from a very small or almost microscopic level.
Let's shift gears, Matt. What about the value proposition for consumers, for our listeners? In other words, what's in it for them? And when it comes time to change spark plugs, is it really worth it to replace a standard spark plug with an Iridium plug?
Well, I usually explain it sort of like this. Even if you don't care about adding horsepower or torque to your vehicle, maybe you're not an enthusiast or that sort of thing, but the gas savings alone will easily cover any additional cost over the conventional plug. So we are talking about 3 to 4% better fuel economy on average, but we've seen over 8% on some vehicles. And don't forget that you're saving on fuel costs over 100,000 miles the life of the plug. So that really adds up over time.
100,000 miles on a spark plug. There were times when we saw 30,000 miles, and then along comes platinum, and we saw 60, then an increase beyond 60. And then you mentioned the multiple tip spark plugs that, to me, appears that used more and shielded the spark more so than what the Iridium twin tip does. So we've opened up the area, just so I can better explain and our folks can better understand. We've opened up the flame front provider, which is the spark generated by the Iridium twin tip plug. We've made it smaller so it gets hotter quicker. Doesn't that also help to keep the plug clean?
Yes, it does. And another key point to understand is that the longevity is also helped by the fact that these tips are so small, because the smaller tips mean there's less required voltage for the plug to fire. And of course, over time, the required voltage exceeds the ability of the coil to keep up with it, and that's what causes the misfire to happen to begin with. So those little tips help in that way as well. It's not just the durability or even the less interference. It's also the fact that they're small and they have lower required voltage over time.
Matt Eaton, Denso Auto Parts. Again, folks, that's the Iridium TT spark plugs. You can go to densott.com for more information. Matt, thank you for joining us today. I have personally used those. I use them in my own automobile, and those plugs work. They're just fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on Car Clinic.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Bobby.